I froze in the doorway, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely think. There he was, my stepson, shirtless, his piercing eyes locking onto mine as if daring me to step closer. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and heavy with something I couldn't name. But as he took a step toward me, I realized this wasn't just a talk, it was a moment that would change everything. Emily always believed she had everything under control. After marrying Daniel, a single father with a 19-year-old son, Noah, she had stepped seamlessly into the role of stepmother. She saw herself as caring yet firm, someone Noah could trust without overstepping boundaries. Their home had always been filled with warmth, family dinners, game nights, and inside jokes that made Emily feel like she truly belonged. Noah, in particular, had become the light of the household. Charming and thoughtful, he had a way of making Emily feel valued, especially when Daniel's long work trips left her feeling invisible. Noah's presence became her anchor during the lonely nights when Daniel was away. He helped around the house, asked about her day, and always seemed to notice when she was feeling down. At first, Emily thought nothing of it. It was just a son taking care of his stepmother. But things started to feel different. She began noticing how Noah's compliments lingered a little longer. "You look beautiful today, Em," he had said one morning, his gaze steady in a way that made her heartbeat quicken. She brushed it off, but the words replayed in her head for days. Then there were the subtle touches, his hand brushing against hers when he passed the salt at dinner, or the way his arm rested behind her on the couch during movie nights. Emily told herself it was innocent. She had to believe it was innocent. But when Noah started skipping plans with his friends to spend time at home with her, Emily couldn't ignore the signs anymore. She caught herself dressing up a little more when he was around, making excuses to be close to him. It was wrong, she knew it was wrong, but the tension between them kept building, and Emily was afraid of what might happen if it snapped. Noah wasn't just Daniel's son anymore. Somewhere along the way, he had become Emily's confidant, her protector, and something more. Now, as she stood at the edge of this dangerous line, Emily couldn't stop asking herself one question. Had they already crossed it? Emily tried to convince herself that everything was normal. She reminded herself that Noah was just being kind, attentive, even, and that it was natural for a stepson to care about his stepmother. But the way his eyes lingered on her, and the moments of silence that stretched too long told a different story. It started with the smallest things. One afternoon, Emily was folding laundry when Noah walked in, leaning casually against the doorway. "You don't have to do all that alone," he said, stepping closer. "Let me help." Before she could protest, he was already beside her, reaching for a pile of shirts. Their hands brushed, and Emily's breath hitched. She tried to laugh it off, but the tension in the air made her voice crack. "Thanks, but I've got it," she said quickly, stepping back to put space between them. Noah didn't move. Instead, his eyes held hers, steady and unreadable. "Why are you always pushing me away?" he asked softly. His words sent a chill through her, but Emily forced a smile. "I'm not," she lied. "I just need to get this done." He didn't push, but the flicker of disappointment in his face stayed with her long after he left the room. The tension grew thicker in the following days. Emily found herself hyper-aware of Noah's presence. How he seemed to hover near her, offering to help with chores or asking about her day in ways that felt more intimate than casual. One evening, while Daniel was out of town, Noah joined Emily in the kitchen as she cooked dinner. "Smells amazing," he said, leaning close enough that she could feel the heat of his body. "Thanks." She tried to keep her voice steady, but her hands trembled as she stirred the sauce. "You've been acting strange lately," he said suddenly. Emily froze. "What do you mean?" "You're avoiding me," he said, stepping closer. "You barely look at me anymore." "I'm not avoiding you." "Then why won't you talk to me?" His voice softened, and Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She turned to face him, but the intensity in his eyes made her pulse quicken. "Noah, this is," she started, but the words caught in her throat. "This is what?" he pressed, stepping even closer. "Too close." Emily swallowed hard, backing away until her hip hit the counter. She felt trapped. "You're my stepson," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Noah's gaze didn't waver. "And you're my stepmother," he said softly. "But that doesn't change how I feel." His words hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. Emily's mind screamed at her to stop this, to set boundaries, but her body betrayed her, rooted to the spot as he reached out and brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "It's wrong," she finally managed to say, but even she didn't sound convincing. "Then tell me to leave," he challenged, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily couldn't. She wanted to, but the words wouldn't come. And Noah didn't move. That night, Emily lay awake in bed, her thoughts racing. She replayed the moment over and over. The heat of his breath, the weight of his words. She told herself it was just a phase, a misunderstanding, but deep down she knew it wasn't. The line between them had blurred, and Emily wasn't sure if it could ever be redrawn. Emily tried to convince herself that she could handle it, that the tension between her and Noah would pass if she just ignored it. But the more she tried to distance herself, the more he seemed to close the gap. One evening, they were watching a movie together, something lighthearted that Emily hoped would ease the tension. She sat at one end of the couch, deliberately keeping space between them, but Noah didn't seem to notice, or care. Halfway through the film, he stretched his arm across the back of the couch, his fingers brushing her shoulder lightly. Emily tensed. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low and concerned. "Yeah," she replied quickly, shifting slightly to break the contact. But he didn't move his arm. Instead, he leaned in just enough for her to feel his breath near her ear. "You don't seem okay," he murmured. Emily's heart raced. She knew she should stand up, make an excuse, and leave the room. But her body refused to cooperate. "I'm fine," she whispered, barely able to meet his gaze. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said, his voice almost tender. Emily finally stood, breaking the spell. "I'm getting some water," she said, her voice shaky as she hurried to the kitchen. She gripped the counter, willing her breathing to steady. But before she could pull herself together, she felt him behind her. "Emily," Noah's voice was softer now, almost pleading. She turned to face him, but the look in his eyes made her chest tighten. "This needs to stop," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then tell me you don't feel it too," he challenged, stepping closer. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came. Instead, she felt his hand brush against hers, lingering just long enough to make her shiver. "Noah, we can't," she said, but even she didn't believe her own words. His fingers curled gently around hers. "Why not?" "Because it's wrong." "Who says it's wrong?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "We're not blood. We're not really family." His words sent a wave of guilt crashing over her, but they also lit a fire she couldn't seem to put out. "Noah!" He cut her off by stepping closer, his other hand reaching up to cup her cheek. "Tell me to stop, and I will," he said softly. Emily's lips parted, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she felt herself leaning into his touch, her resolve crumbling. Then, as if sensing her surrender, he closed the distance, his lips brushing against hers in the lightest, most dangerous kiss she had ever known. She pulled back immediately, her breath ragged. "No," she said, shaking her head. "We can't do this." But he didn't let go. "Emily, I've never felt this way about anyone," he said. "And I know you feel it too." Tears welled in her eyes as she pushed him away. "You need to go to bed," she said firmly. For a moment he looked like he might argue, but then he nodded. "Good night," he said softly, his eyes lingering on her before he turned and walked away. The days that followed were agonizing. Noah didn't push, but his presence was everywhere. Emily found herself hyper-aware of every look, every touch, and every word they exchanged. One afternoon, she was organizing the laundry when Noah appeared in the doorway again. "Can we talk?" he asked. "Noah, please," she said, not even looking up. "I just need to know," he said, stepping closer. "Do you feel it too?" Emily froze, the shirt she was folding slipping from her fingers. "It doesn't matter what I feel," she said quietly. "It matters to me," he said, moving closer until she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "No, Before she could finish, he reached out, gently cupping her face again. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted. "And I don't want to." Tears streamed down Emily's cheeks as she shook her head. "We can't," she whispered. "But you don't want me to stop, do you?" Her silence was answer enough. And then, before she could think, his lips were on hers again, this time deeper, more desperate. Emily knew she should push him away, but instead she melted into the kiss, her hands tangling in his hair as weeks of tension finally exploded. When they pulled apart, both of them were breathless. "This is wrong," she said again, her voice trembling. "I don't care," Noah replied, his eyes burning into hers. "I love you, Emily." And for the first time, she let herself believe it might be true. Emily sat in the dimly lit living room, her fingers trembling as she clutched a mug of tea that had long gone cold. She replayed the kiss with Noah over and over in her mind, each time convincing herself it had been a mistake, only to remember the way her body had responded, the way his words had burrowed into her heart. She didn't know how much longer she could keep pretending everything was normal. Noah's glances lingered too long, his touch felt too intimate, and the space between them had become suffocating. And then it happened. It was late, nearly midnight, and Emily had just finished cleaning the kitchen when Noah walked in. He wore nothing but sweatpants, his toned chest still damp from a shower. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low and husky. Emily swallowed hard, forcing herself to focus on wiping down the counter. "No," she murmured. Noah stepped closer, his bare feet silent against the tile floor. "Me either," he said. "I keep thinking about us." Her hand froze mid-wipe. "There is no us, Noah," she said firmly, though her voice trembled. "Stop lying," he said, stepping closer until his body was only inches from hers. "I'm not." But before she could finish, he reached out and gently took the cloth from her hand, setting it aside. "Look at me," he said softly. Emily shook her head, but he tilted her chin up until her eyes met his. "Tell me you don't feel this," he whispered. Tears welled in her eyes. "It doesn't matter what I feel," she said. "It's wrong." "Why?" he demanded, his voice thick with emotion. "Because someone decided we're supposed to follow rules that don't make sense? Because you're afraid of what people would think." Emily's breath hitched as his hand brushed against her cheek, wiping away a tear. "Noah, say it," he whispered. "Say you don't want this, and I'll walk away." She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. And then he kissed her again. This time there was no hesitation. The dam broke, and all the tension they had been holding back poured out in a desperate, fiery embrace. Emily's hands clutched at him, pulling him closer as weeks of guilt and longing melted into raw passion. They didn't stop. They couldn't. It was only afterward, when they lay tangled in sheets in silence, that the weight of what had just happened came crashing down. Emily sat up, clutching the blanket to her chest. "This can't happen again," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Noah propped himself up on his elbow, his eyes searching hers. "Why not?" "Because it's wrong," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You're my stepson." He reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "No, I'm not," he said quietly. Emily froze. "What are you talking about?" Noah sat up, his expression serious. "Dad told me a few months ago," he admitted. "I'm not his biological son. My mom was pregnant when they met, and he took me in as his own." Emily's head spun as the words sank in. "But, you're still my stepson," she said, her voice trembling. "Not by blood," Noah replied. "And not by choice." His words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Emily shook her head, her mind racing. "This doesn't change anything," she said, scrambling to gather her clothes. "It changes everything," Noah said, standing to block her path. "No, it doesn't," she cried. "It's still wrong, Noah. It's still—" He cut her off with a kiss, but this time Emily pulled away, tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I won't." Noah's expression hardened, his jaw clenching. "So that's it?" he asked. "You're just going to pretend this didn't happen?" Emily couldn't answer. She pushed past him, fleeing to her room and locking the door behind her. The next morning, the house was suffocatingly quiet. Noah was gone when Emily woke up, leaving nothing but an empty coffee mug in the sink and a note that simply said, "I'll give you space, but this isn't over." Emily crumpled the note, her chest heaving with sobs. She had crossed a line she could never uncross, and no amount of guilt or regret could change what had happened. But what scared her most wasn't the mistake she'd made. It was the terrifying realization that she didn't want it to end. Emily spent the next few days trapped in a fog of guilt and confusion. She avoided Noah as much as she could, locking herself in her room or leaving the house whenever she heard him moving around. But no matter how far she tried to run, her thoughts always dragged her back to that night, to his touch, his words, and the dangerous feelings she couldn't seem to bury. The air in the house felt suffocating, heavy with unspoken tension. When Noah finally confronted her, it wasn't with anger, but with quiet determination. "You can't ignore me forever," he said, standing in the kitchen doorway as Emily washed dishes. "I'm not ignoring you," she replied, though her trembling hands gave her away. "Yes, you are." He stepped closer, and Emily's heart began to race. "We need to talk about what happened." "There's nothing to talk about," she said quickly, setting the plate down too hard. It clattered in the sink, and she flinched. "That's not true, and you know it." Emily turned to face him, her eyes already brimming with tears. "It was a mistake, Noah. We both know that. A mistake." His voice broke, and the pain in his eyes nearly shattered her resolve. "You really think that's all it was?" Emily swallowed hard, forcing herself to nod. "Yes." Noah's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "You're lying," he said. "Even if I am, it doesn't matter," Emily said, her voice trembling. We can't do this. We can't be, whatever this is. But we already are, Noah argued, stepping closer. You can't just erase what happened. You can't erase how I feel about you. Emily shook her head and turned away, but Noah grabbed her wrist, gently but firmly. Look at me, he said, his voice softer now. She didn't want to, but she did. I love you, he said, the words hitting her like a punch to the chest. And I know you love me too. Tears spilled down Emily's cheeks. It doesn't matter, she said. Love isn't enough. Not like this. Noah released her hand, stepping back as hurt flashed across his face. Then what do you want me to do? He asked. Pretend I don't care about you? Pretend this didn't happen. Yes, Emily whispered. That's exactly what I need you to do. Noah stared at her for a long moment before nodding slowly. Fine, he said, his voice flat. If that's what you really want. Days passed and Noah kept his promise. He avoided her, barely speaking except for polite greetings. But the silence hurt more than Emily expected. She missed him, the way he made her feel seen, the way he made her laugh, and the way he looked at her like she was the most important person in the world. She told herself it was for the best, but the ache in her chest wouldn't go away. One evening, Emily came home to find Noah packing a bag in the living room. What are you doing? She asked, her voice panicked. I'm leaving, he said without looking at her. Her heart dropped. Leaving? Why? Because I can't stay here, Emily. He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with pain. Not like this. Not when every time I see you. It feels like I'm breaking all over again. Noah, you don't have to do this, she said, stepping closer. Yes, I do. Emily's eyes filled with tears. Where will you go? I'll figure it out, he said. I just need some space. Noah, don't, he said, cutting her off. You made it clear how you feel. I have to respect that. Emily wanted to stop him, to tell him to stay, but the words wouldn't come. She watched helplessly as he picked up his bag and walked out the door, leaving her alone with the silence. The days that followed were unbearable. Emily wandered through the empty house, haunted by memories of Noah, his laughter, his touch, and the way he made her feel alive. She told herself she had done the right thing, but it didn't feel right. It felt like she had ripped out a piece of her own heart and thrown it away. And then late one night, there was a knock at the door. Emily opened it to find Noah standing there, soaked from the rain, his eyes filled with desperation. I can't do this, he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. I can't be away from you. Before Emily could react, he pulled her into his arms, his lips crashing against hers. And this time she didn't stop him. Emily lay awake in the dim glow of the early morning light, her head resting on Noah's chest. His steady breathing should have calmed her, but instead, her thoughts churned relentlessly. She had crossed every line, broken every rule she once believed in, and now there was no turning back. The weight of what they had done hung heavy in the room. Her heart was at war with her conscience, torn between the love she felt and the guilt that gnawed at her soul. Noah stirred beside her, his arm tightening around her waist as though he feared she might slip away. Morning, he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. Emily didn't respond right away. She sat up slowly, pulling the sheet around her. We need to talk, she said softly. Noah propped himself up on one elbow, his eyes instantly alert. About what? About this, she said, gesturing between them. About us. His expression darkened. You're not having second thoughts, are you? She bit her lip, fighting back tears. No, it's not that. Then what is it? Emily took a deep breath, gathering the courage to face the truth. This can't last, Noah, she said, her voice trembling. It's not fair, to you, to me, to anyone. We're living in a fantasy, but eventually, the real world will catch up with us. Noah sat up, his jaw tightening. Who cares what the world thinks, he said. We're not hurting anyone. But we are, Emily said, her voice cracking. We're hurting ourselves. This, whatever this is, can't be healthy. It's built on secrecy and guilt, and it's only going to destroy us. Noah's eyes softened, but there was pain in his gaze. I love you, Emily, he said quietly. I don't care what anyone else thinks. Emily's tears finally spilled over. I love you too, she admitted. But sometimes love isn't enough. Noah reached for her hand, but she pulled away, her heart breaking all over again. I need to let you go, she said, barely able to get the words out. You deserve someone who can love you without shame or fear. And I need to find a way to forgive myself. For the first time, Noah looked defeated. He stood slowly, his shoulders slumped. So that's it? He asked, his voice hollow. Emily nodded, unable to meet his eyes. This has to end. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Emily's life. Noah moved out, leaving the house emptier than she had ever imagined. She busied herself with work, friends, and long walks, but nothing seemed to fill the void he had left behind. At night, she replayed their moments together, both cherishing and regretting every second. She knew she had made the right decision, but that didn't make it any easier. She missed him, his smile, his touch, and the way he made her feel alive. But she also knew that loving him meant letting him go. One day, months later, Emily received a text. It was from Noah. "I'm okay. I hope you are too. I'll always love you." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time, she let them fall without shame. She had learned the hardest lesson of all, that love, no matter how intense, couldn't erase the consequences of crossing forbidden boundaries. And as painful as it was, she knew she had to live with the choices she had made. What would you have done if you were in Emily's place? Could love ever justify crossing forbidden boundaries? Or was her decision to let Noah go the only way to move forward? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more gripping and emotional stories like this one. You won't want to miss what's coming next.